take on in the general election the current Republican congressperson, Lori Chavez DeRemer. For over 100 years, the Portland City Club has hosted public functions, debates, research to help Portlanders make informed decisions about elections and public policy. We are committed to providing space for people to gather and engage in civic dialogue. We give special thanks to Kayla Kennett, our communications manager, for her technical support, especially tonight. Please note in your calendars these upcoming City Club programs. Tomorrow, we have an in-person debate featuring the two Democratic candidates running for Oregon State Treasurer, Elizabeth Steiner and Jeff Goodman. This event will be held at PSU's University Place. Doors open at 11 o'clock and a lunch buffet is available. You can find out more about all of our programs at the City Club website, which is pdxcityclub.org. And now about our two candidates. Janelle Bynum, Oregon State Representative of House District 39, and Jamie Mcleod Skinner, attorney, engineer, and small business owner. They're competing for the Democratic nomination to represent Oregon's 5th Congressional District. This unusual district extends over 5,000 square miles and includes most of Clackamas, Deschutes, and Lynn counties, and parts of Marion and Multnomah counties. It stretches from the edges of Portland to the city of Bend, with a lot of territory in between. The winner of this Democratic primary faces an extraordinarily tight general election race. Of the district's 500,000 registered voters, the incumbent Republican won the 2022 race by only 7,300 votes. This primary is a high priority for national Democrats seeking to flip the U.S. House, currently split, well, at last count, between 219 Republicans and 213 Democrats, with the majority riding on the outcomes of just a few swing districts. This race has commanded national attention. The City Club maintains a nonpartisan approach to policy. We are faithful to that in our participation today. A candidate's appearance tonight does not constitute their endorsement by the City Club of Portland or their affection for the City Club of Portland. Our moderator tonight is Les Zeitz, a veteran publisher, editor, and investigative journalist. Les has spent 25 years as a reporter and editor at the Oregonian. He is currently editor and publisher of the Mcleod Enterprise in Eastern Oregon, as well as editor and CEO of the Salem Reporter. Les was twice a Pulitzer Prize finalist as an investigative reporter and won the coveted George Polk Award with his Oregon colleagues. Here are tonight's rules of engagement. Les will give each candidate 3 minutes for introductory remarks. Les will then pose questions and allow each candidate 2 minutes to respond. Les may ask one question for each candidate to answer, or he may ask each candidate a different question on a related topic. In addition, registrants to this program were given the opportunity to send in questions in advance. We will rotate the sequence of candidate questions. If a candidate chooses to respond to or challenge something said by their opponent, they are welcome to do so during the time allotted for their next response. Candidates will be able to see how much time they have left by checking the timer display on their screen. I ask both candidates to be respectful of your time limits. At the conclusion of questions, each candidate will have 2 minutes for final remarks. Thank you again to our candidates and our moderator, and especially to those of you listening. Les, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sam, and good evening and welcome to all of you who have joined us this evening for what I expect will be an interesting and informative 90 minutes. The candidates were advised of broad topics to be covered tonight, but they were not shared the questions. I have sole responsibility for their framing and their content, as I will for the follow-up questions that we ask. Our aim tonight is to provide voters a true sense of how each of these candidates would act on issues important to Oregon and to her people. I want to extend a welcome to Janelle and to Jamie, and let's get started with the opening remarks. Janelle, the floor is yours for 3 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm State Representative Janelle Bynum, and I'm running to represent the best of Oregon values in the halls of Congress. I first ran for office because I wanted to deliver for Oregon's children an education system that would allow them to achieve their dreams. I wanted to pass opportunity on. I wanted a long-term solution that would invest in career readiness, mental health, and more. And as state representative, I've delivered. The Student Success Act with over $2 billion for Oregon students. And in Congress, I'll deliver on full funding for special education, additional residency positions so we have enough doctors to treat mom and grandma as they age, and solutions to stamp out student debt. As a mom of 4, I'm always talking about how I can develop my ideas through the lens and experiences of my children. And I'll share with you that recently my daughter Christine, who's just finishing college, was recently looking at schools to pursue her dream of being a dentist. She wanted to spend her next 4 years in a place that will protect her access to the ballot, her reproductive rights, and can offer her safe and affordable housing. And she knows that she can always come back home to Oregon because I've delivered on those too. Friends, we see what's happening in DC. It's a choice between democracy and autocracy. When Republicans here at home were choosing chaos with their walkouts in 2019, I was one of only 2 lawmakers who were able to deliver bills to their communities that session. In 2020, during the George Floyd era, I led the legislature to deliver over 23 bipartisan bills on public safety and civil rights. In 2023, after having lost a big Intel plant to Ohio, I delivered the state's biggest investment, the Oregon CHIPS Act, which yields $43 billion in economic activity and over 6,000 jobs. In Congress, I'll work with our entire federal delegation to deliver on the infrastructure, help for family farms, immigration reform, more jobs, and climate change policies our state needs. In closing, I'll share with you something I learned from my son, who's a running back at the University of Oregon. Go Ducks. My husband keeps an eye on him through Instagram, and one day he said to me, "I think Ellis got another tattoo." I called and asked Ellis about the tattoo, and he said, "Mom, it says me versus me." He said that sometimes it means that we can be our own worst enemy or our greatest source of inspiration. And the battle for us as Democrats is recognizing that this seat is ours. This seat is ours to take back, and the House is ours to take back. By electing me, the only candidate who has beaten Lori Chavez DeRemer not once, but twice, you'll have a proven leader, just like the mailman who shows up every day. As your next Congresswoman from Oregon, I'll deliver for you. Thank you.
Okay. Jamie, your turn, 3 minutes.
There we go. Thank you so much for the City Club team for organizing this. Les, thanks for your work on bringing great journalism to rural Oregon. My name is Jamie Mcleod Skinner, and I'm running to represent Oregonians in Congress in the 5th Congressional District because I'm the best fit for the district, understand the issues, and then also best positioned to win in November. I'm an attorney, engineer, small business owner, former union member, and currently working on affordable housing projects and community resilience. More about me, I'm a stepmom of 4. My wife and I live in rural Central Oregon, as do my mom, sister, and in-laws. I'm the proud product of Oregon public schools, from high school in Southern Oregon, where my family actually worked on a small family farm, to law school at the University of Oregon, where I focused on water law and Indian law. I've served 12 years in elected office in urban and rural areas, including in rural Central Oregon, where I've worked across the urban-rural divide to provide results for Oregonians. Working together is how we get things done. I began my public service over in war-torn Bosnia and Kosovo, repairing schools and hospitals. That international experience, I think, is especially valuable during this time. In Congress, I'll focus both on the kitchen table issues, but also the big picture. Those kitchen table issues are all about cost of living, housing, affordable housing, and healthcare, and childcare, and education. And I hope we get to talk about those some more during our conversation tonight. For the big picture, it's about protecting our democracy, something I saw firsthand working in former war zones. It's about protecting our fundamental rights, including when we start a family, access to abortion healthcare, access to the ability to have fertility treatments and contraception. These are all on the line. And yes, we have access now in Oregon, but a national ban will take that away. And that's something that radical Republicans are trying to do. I've got a long track record on environmental stewardship, working on the climate crisis, from helping to stop the trajectory we're on and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, to stewardship on the OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, protecting our natural resources, to also leading wildfire recovery after the 2020 wildfires. Stewardship of our natural resources is key to our economy and our community. Oregon's fifth, as was mentioned, Oregon's only purple toss-up district. Only a third of the voters are Democrats. And my success having one of the closest races in the country last cycle is because of my ability to work across that divide. I'm actually the only one who's beaten Lori and Clackamas and Deschutes County, which make up 2/3 of the voters in the purple counties within the district. I'm accountable to everyday Oregonians. I don't take corporate PAC money, and the only one that's race who can say that. And I'm also really proud to have the support of everyday Oregonians throughout the district, educators, working people, and proud that my colleagues have consistently chosen me to lead them for my elected roles and appointed roles and professional academic roles as well. Biggest influence on me is my mom, who is a retired teacher in Central Oregon, but look forward to tonight's conversation.
Great. Thanks, Jamie. Thanks, Janelle. All right, time to roll up our sleeves and get to work. So, Janelle, first question is going to go to you. A good number of rural Oregonians believe climate change policies will harm their lifestyles, their jobs, transportation, farms, and industry. In evaluating federal legislation, how would you heed such concerns?
Well, as an experienced legislator, we saw this argument play out when we were looking at climate bills in the legislature just a few years ago. And the argument was that, people couldn't afford higher gas prices. And I took the position that when people tell you that something is going to harm them and they've shown you evidence, you believe them. And so it's a balance. It's not an argument between, for me, who loves the land more and who's more of a purist on climate issues. It's a matter of how do we get to yes, given all of the circumstances that we face. And so what I've done is delivered on issues that help move the conversation forward. So it's not just enough to say, okay, here's my proposal, you take it or leave it. It's how do you work across the aisle? How do you work with farmers and ranchers and everyday working people to solve their problems? So this legislative session, I proposed the Clean Energy Manufacturing Fund. And that is so that Oregon can take its position as a leader in technology and make more solutions that fit everyday working families and fit rural families and their budgets. I will just say that our climate proposals, they not only affect rural families, but they also affect urban families. If the cost of gas goes up anywhere, let's just say we're talking about gasoline, if the cost of gas goes up anywhere, that is a direct hit to working families. And I will always continue to stand up for working families. And I will always say, we can innovate our way out of this and we can work our way out of this. It's not my way or the highway. I think we've all noticed that these walkouts that happened in Oregon are detrimental to democracy. And I certainly don't want to see that happen at the federal level.
Jamie?
Yeah, this is the question's a great example of how we're seeing the impact across the board, but people are experiencing it differently. So our homes are literally burning down on Central Oregon until it's a better year this year, but we had terrible drought. So the impacts are there. Part of the frustration I've heard in talking to folks on family farms and ranchers is that a lot of the investment has been in passenger vehicles, but we haven't had R&D into some of the heavier equipment that's needed to make this transition. And then also we need resources to make sure that support so that farmers can actually get the support they need to buy this infrastructure and buy the equipment they will need to make the transition to having equipment that's powerful enough to do the job, but also can get the job done. Your comment about working lands and the folks who make their living off of our lands, but also who invest back and help to put food on our table, is the work we do with OWEB, the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. So it's investing in good stewardship of our natural resources, helping to protect them for long term. It's good for our economy, soil regeneration, all of these issues that we invest public dollars in now is part of the long-term solution. And we do this in partnership with folks on working lands. The other issues that we're facing in rural areas is access to rural broadband. I mean, that's another issue for equipment that folks are struggling with. But the drought is very real. I've worked in a bipartisan fashion, bringing folks together to talk about some of the solutions for water banks and some of the things we need to address the climate crisis. We're feeling the impacts. And so we do need to address it on a long-term basis and also on resiliency, but we need to invest more in R&D and also helping our farmers and ranchers transition their equipment in ways that we're getting subsidies for pasture vehicles. We're not seeing that in ag areas right now.
Okay. So Jamie, move on to the next question. By running against the incumbent, you're essentially making the case that she needs to go. Let's put this in employment context. Why do you think the current office holder should be fired?
She hasn't done the job. First of all, she made promises up front, and I remember hearing those firsthand about being a moderate and also about working together on joint solutions. She has voted consistently with the extremists in her party. She talks a good game, but when it comes to voting, her votes have not been there for Oregonians, for veterans, for public safety, for our environment. You're talking just now, or you're asking about climate issues and those climate impacts that are impacting us in rural areas. And she was part of the clawback of resources that had been allocated through the bipartisan infrastructure bill. And she was part of voting for taking those away from Oregon and Oregonians. She has also, in her endorsement of Donald Trump, he has targeted and undermine the potential solutions, from solutions at the border to solutions on bipartisan efforts to address protecting our democracy in terms of addressing public safety. Votes she has taken have also hurt our veterans. And in the ongoing threat for protecting access to abortion, she's talked about a national ban, and it's something that she has advocated for and spoken up for. She has pretended to be moderate, but that's not how her votes have gone. And that's not where Oregonians are at. She's also not showing up in the district. That's something near and dear to the heart of folks throughout the district, and a frustration they have with folks who just call it in, but rather than show up and actually answer questions and are accountable to their votes. So she hasn't, in an opportunity right now with this close and very divisive and dysfunctional Congress, she's had an opportunity to show some leadership that she claimed she would have, and she just hasn't done it. So she's also not provided some of the solutions we need in rural areas, and the ag bill and reauthorization of the farm bill is something she has not done, and she's on that committee.
Okay, thank you. Janelle, so why should the current U.S. representative from District 5 be booted?
I agree with Jamie Mcleod Skinner on those points. And I believe that what's more important is that we recognize that Lori Chavez DeRemer runs with extremists. And quite frankly, if you lay down with dogs, you get up with fleas. You can't shake that from your record when you're voting with the majority that is not moving our country forward. I think what's really important to keep in mind is that What I've done is delivered over and over and over again for constituents in a purple district. I've delivered on reproductive health consistently. Lori DeRemer has not. I've delivered on town halls. I was the first legislator, to my knowledge, who transitioned to online, to Zoom town halls, because I was very committed to making sure that I showed up for them each and every time. I've done taco town halls. I've done walking town halls. I've gone to people's jobs. I've gone to people's schools. I represent people whether you live or work in my district. I go the extra mile for people, and that is one thing that Lori Chavez DeRemer cannot say that she's done. I've worked across the aisle to deliver public safety bills. I didn't assume that I knew everything about what it was like to police in a community that may be very dangerous. I worked across the aisle and I worked with my colleagues to develop solutions that worked for the entire community. I made sure that I supported farm worker overtime and supported legislation to make sure that when outdoor workers are experiencing extreme heat or poor quality air, that there's recourse for them, that there's safety measures for them, and that we value the work that they do. Lori Chavez DeRemer can't point to any of those things. She's all talk.
Okay, thanks. So there's questions for you first, Janelle. If you're elected, you may be in a continuing minority in the House of Representatives, and Congress, of course, is a very different beast than state legislatures. Besides introducing legislation that likely won't go anywhere and putting out press releases and holding press conferences, tell us, how do you intend to get anything besides talk accomplished if this current political environment continues?
One of the things I've learned in serving in the state legislature is even if you're in the majority here, there's no guarantee that your policies will pass. But what I shared with you just earlier is that there's the work of legislating, and then there's the work of showing up for your people. So what I'm often asked to do is show up for students in the district. So talking with them about democracy, encouraging them to sign up and vote. They have, our high school students actually have more power than we give them credit for. They could actually run their school elections with the numbers that they have. They could be a powerful voting bloc. I also show up in a way where maybe an organization is going for a grant in some way, shape, or form. I show up for them in that way. I also am making sure that we are an ambassador for democracy, and that we encourage people through our town halls and our influence in the state legislature or even cities and counties. We show up for them in those ways. So it's not just if you pass a bill in Congress, it's also how do you make sure that people in your community know that you have their back 110%. And that's what people have loved about me as their state representative. They have loved that I've always shown up. There's a set of triplets right around the corner from my house. They had questions. One had a question about democracy, and I told them, I'll stop by on my way home. And they're like, you'll stop by our house? I said, yeah, I'm your neighbor. And so it's that type of advocacy, very staunch advocacy for the people in the district, showing up when they have problems, clearing the way. For instance, I had another constituent who was having problems with their water bill, and we had a conference with the city of Portland to understand why their water bill wasn't the way it should be. So it's showing up in addition to legislation.
Jamie?
Yeah, it's, I will say that I don't think we should be daunted or intimidated by different ideas and disagreement. From my time in Bosnia and Kosovo, I remember having this reflection that seeing the alternative to our democracy. And I really came to believe then that the greatness of our democracy is that we have the best imperfect form of government, but it requires us to engage. It requires us to work across the divide. And this is something that we have to do on a regular basis in purple areas. We don't have the luxury of just throwing elbows and getting our way, being in the majority. In the 12 years that I've been in elected office in urban and rural areas, I've actually always been in the political minority. And the real gift of that was that you actually learn how to do the job. It's not just about throwing elbows. It's about getting to know your colleagues, getting to know what they're interested in, having to learning how to communicate your values to them and to their constituents and those that influence them so that you can move your objectives forward. And I've been really successful in doing that in purple areas, again, in urban and rural areas. That influence behind the scene is really key because by the time legislation comes up, there's been a lot of discussion about it. So those behind closed doors conversations are key. And that having trust in someone and knowing you can rely on them and they will stand with you. And this is a big issue, especially for working families who want to know they've got an advocate, for everyday Oregonians to understand the issues throughout the district. You know, one example that we see in Lynn County is the corporate chicken farm takeover, and working closely with Republicans and trying to find solutions so that we don't have an impact on our small family farms. When we were facing drought challenges in Central Oregon, I convened a group of Republicans and Democrats, and we queued something up that was later passed by the legislature, the water bank, so that we could provide those solutions. On the Education Service District Board, I work with my colleagues, my conservative colleagues, to pass what people would consider progressive, but it was simply about protecting our kids and communities.
Well, let's stick with this for just a minute, because I heard a lot of talk about constituent service and meeting people in purple districts here in Oregon. We have Congress, in Congress, we have people bailing out of their positions because the climate is so bitter and so partisan that experienced legislators who want to get things done are just throwing up their hands and saying they can't do. I think our voters would like to hear from you, Janelle, first, and then Jamie, a little more about what you would do in Congress to work across an aisle that's not interested in reaching. There's not much back and forth at this moment, unless you disagree with that. Janelle?
I actually disagree with that. I have found that there are different ways to relate to people. What I learned in the legislature was that actually we had I think it was like Tuesday midday prayer group. And that's where I got to know a lot of Republicans, quite frankly. And I think with effort, you build relationships. I've always been the minority in the room. I've always had to learn how to get along with different people. I've always had to learn how to code switch, whether it was as a woman, whether it was as a Black woman, whether it's as a mom, whether it's as a small business owner. I've always felt like I've never had a problem getting along with people and understanding their perspective. So, you know, when I was in graduate school, I went to school with a lot of people who had families. I didn't have a family then. A lot of families were Mormon. I have employees that come from diverse backgrounds. And so for me, it's a curiosity about how they live their lives and how do you work together to get things done. I suspect there are people on both sides of the aisle who are engaging in a little bit of crazy. And there are people on both sides of the aisle who wish that would stop. So for me, it's about not encouraging extremism, and it's about standing up and being the vision for Americans that you want to see. We call it at work the shadow of a leader. And I think that you also project what you attract. And that is very important as well. So I'm hoping that people maintain faith in our democracy. I am an eternal optimist. I don't think you can be in politics and be a pessimist. And so that's why I would like to be your next Congresswoman from Oregon 5.
Okay. Jamie, you want to take a run at that?
Yeah, I actually agree with a lot of the points raised. And I think, being able to step outside of your familiar and, in adding to the code switching as an out lesbian, I came out as a young adult, and in a time when it was not just meant that you could lose your job and your home, but it could mean you could lose your life as well. And being, that's why also showing up for me is so important, and showing up and listening. Yeah, I've been to the district, as mentioned before, only includes about 6 counties. I've been to every county in the state and in some of the most red, rural, conservative parts, and had some of the best conversations. And really, we agree on core issues. And so I think that the challenge and the thing that so many voters are hungry for is how we can move forward on those issues. Part of it is also translating across the divide. We see this a lot in urban rural areas. I literally have done trainings on how to communicate across the divide. But to your point, Les, going back to Congress, the bottom line is the folks who are there want to be reelected, and they want to be responsive to their constituents. And so one of the things that I think Democrats have been horrible at is being able to effectively communicate our ideas, our values, and our issues. That's why I've been so successful in purple areas. I mean, I actually beat Lori in the 2 purple counties in this district. Looking at Deschutes County, I've outperformed every Democrat running for president since 1964, because it's that ability to bridge those divides. In Congress, it's about getting to know, building relationships with your colleagues. It's understanding what's of concern to them. It's also being able to communicate with their voters. And this is something Democrats need to do across the board. And reason why we need more rural Democrats in Congress, because there is a perception, real or perceived, that urban Democrats look down their nose at rural folks. And that's a frustration so many folks have. And also being a rural Democrat, why I've been so successful in bridging those divides.
Right. Okay, Jamie, this question is for you. Immigration is a hot topic all across the United States. What is your assessment of how the influx of undocumented migrants has impacted Oregon?
Well, the system is broken. And what's really frustrating is that Republicans purposely, and there were some Republicans who tried to queue up a solution, and the Republicans, the majority specifically killed that legislation in Congress. The president was carrying it. Some real key Republicans were carrying it. Once Trump said he was against it because he wanted to use it as a political issue, we saw it fall apart. So in my conversations with farmers in Central Oregon, they want to see comprehensive immigration reform. Is part, ag, as you well know, is a major part of our economy, or it's an important part of our economy. And farmers need more workers. We also have family members who want to reunify. We also have folks who have lived their whole lives as Americans, who and DACA recipients who, they've been Americans. They deserve to have that recognition and status. We do have some challenges here in Oregon around, some of those practical housing and some of those other issues. But the threats that have been made is not something that we're experiencing in Oregon. It's actually just the opposite. You also talk to businesses who are looking to hire folks. We have unemployment's really low. So the opportunity to bolster our workforce and folks who come in pay taxes. But we have so many members of the community who are looking and leaning into wanting to see comprehensive immigration reform. And this, again, is where those relationships, not just in the urban areas, but also in the rural areas, is really key. So I would build a coalition starting with farmers and then also with, folks who are wanting to, again, asylees and groups that represent these organizations. We need to get out of our silos, our political silos, when developing solutions. That's how we'll move legislation forward. But it's, I've worked in refugee resettlement. I've worked in this field before and overseen these offices. We need to get more resources down there to help make sure we have a secure border, and we're processing as we need to.
Okay, Janelle, you want to take a run?
Well, I think we all recognize that the immigration crisis is right at our doorsteps, and we need to make sure that the migrant crisis isn't a political football. I think, as Jamie mentioned, Republicans had an opportunity. Lori Chavez DeRemer had an opportunity to step up and pass immigration reform, and it's a step in the right direction. It's not the be all end all, because we know we have a lot of problems with our immigration system here in this country, but it was important that we make a move in that direction. I think the way it's showing up in Oregon is, number one, we need to agree that immigrants form the backbone of our economy. They certainly form the backbone of our agrarian economy. And it's important for us to make sure that we treat people as humans, not, again, as a political football. I also think that it's, when I look at this just from a national perspective, Americans have said they believe that our immigration system is broken, and they believe that the asylum system is particularly broken, and people should have access to a hearing that is fair, fast, and final. And that way people aren't taking advantage of that system and creating additional burdens on both the border communities and communities up and down the coast. What is really interesting, I think, is that we have not invested enough in our hearing system, nor in our immigration and control agents. And that is where we need to make additional federal investments. So we're seeing it at our doorstep. We saw in the newspaper in Oregonian, I think this weekend, that people were being offered tents. We know that's not a humane solution, and we know Oregonians aren't okay with that.
Janelle, we'll start with you on this one. The House Conservative Climate Caucus includes Oregon's 2 Republican representatives. The caucus agrees there is climate change, but that, quote, practical and exportable answers can be found in innovation embraced by the free market, and that the progressive climate proposals, quote, would hurt our economy, American workers, and national security. The question is, why shouldn't the federal government stay out of the way and let American free enterprise take care of greenhouse emissions and other contributors to climate change?
I think this is where when you have, so one of the things we had in the legislature was like sister districts. And that was how I was able to work with Representative Noble on police accountability and civil rights. And it was only by understanding his perspective. He's a very conservative, well, maybe the people considered him moderate, but he was conservative to me. But by having an understanding of what it looked like from his perspective, we could make compromises. It didn't mean that everything that he proposed was right and everything I proposed was wrong. But I think it's important for democracy for us to have this tangle, for us to have this tension between an idea from West Virginia and an idea from Oregon. That is what makes democracy beautiful. I believe you can innovate out of many things that have happened here with respect to climate change. But I also believe that in some cases, government intervention is absolutely necessary. In my mother's hometown of Conway, South Carolina, they started to notice that my uncle, her younger brother, his friends were dying. And they started to believe that the water was being tainted from the paper mills. And they started to understand, oh, there's a connection between pollution and our lives. And I think that that is something, and that's in a very conservative area. I think in Oregon, there have also been conversations about methane infecting our soil and, family farmers having concerns with that. So it's not, to me, it's not a progressive versus a conservative argument. It's like, how do we live? How do we see the world? And can we have civil and sane conversations about what to do about it? I think we need both. Government regulation as well as innovation.
Jamie?
I don't think it hurts to have both a stick and a carrot approach, but to your question, the bottom line is a just transition to renewable energy is not happening fast enough. And so if we were to stay on the wait and see track where things would just escalate, the crisis that we're witnessing, that we're experiencing, would escalate just that much faster. And it's exponential with the climate crisis. Look, wildfire doesn't check party affiliation when it's burning down homes. We saw that in San Diego Canyon. We saw that in Southern Oregon, where I worked at led wildfire recovery as an interim city manager, just less than 10 miles from where I finished high school. Drought is destroying our family farms in Central Oregon. And I've literally spoken to proud farmers who've been in tears because they were losing their cattle. They're having to sell their cattle because they couldn't feed them. And that's gutting our economy. That's harming our economy. So we have to do something about it. And I believe the solution is to be investing in, not just additional emergency response so that people can have a response to what's happening, but also in the long term in a renewable energy grid. And that's something we need to maintain a steady grid. But as we look at that transition, those are good paying energy jobs, good paying union jobs, but also to make sure that we have a clean energy future. And that's a real opportunity for us here in Oregon. You ask about conservative versus liberal. Look at Lake County, one of the most conservative counties in the state, and they're 100% renewable. So this is good. It just makes good business sense, and that's why it's being leaned into. We should be looking at this as a way to really strengthen our economy. I know that we sell our wind farms along the Columbia Gorge. We sell those electrons to folks in other states. So our solar, our wind power, that can be a real strength of our economy, but it's also good for long-term environment and good for our farms, our ranches, our air, our water, and it's good for urban areas, of course, but we often think about it as the focus of just urban areas.
Well, let's stick with this question for just a moment more, because it is so important to all elements of life in Oregon. Janelle, be more specific about the federal government role that you see. What would you change or expand in the federal role? You referred to it in your earlier answer that there is a role for the federal government. What is it, and what more do you want to see done at the federal level?
Well, it's interesting. I don't necessarily feel that the federal government is the be all end all of legislative policy. We had an issue in the legislature just this past session where the federal government wanted to explore offshore energy options. And we here in the state wanted to say, well, before you start to do any of that, you talk to us first. And so it is this collaboration between the people who live there and the federal government and our national policies. That's how I see it, to put a finer point on it. I think at the federal level, we collect a lot of information and you try to do the most good for the most number of people. It's almost the same as the state, but not quite. I think the goals are a little loftier. It's a lot harder to implement, but the goals need to happen at the federal level, just like when we had CAFE standards for fuel efficiency for vehicles. So it's much more of the policy at the federal level, and at the states, we implement it as best we can in our communities. So the offshore energy example is the best example I can give you. I will also make another fine point. It's really interesting that just like Oregon had this conversation about what does offshore energy development look like here, South Carolina was also having that very same conversation. They didn't want actually windmills on their coast, and that became a really big political issue about 2 or 3 years ago in their elections. So it's really interesting that states still want to have control over their coastlines, and the federal government is being told, not so fast.
So, Jamie?
Yeah, and I do think there are partnerships on decision making, but the reason why the federal government has a really key role to play is because investments in, wow, that was a quick one. It was because of major infrastructure investments need the help of the federal government. And we saw this with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. Again, there was some additional investments that were clawed back on energy, renewable energy projects that Lori voted to do, and that hurt us here in Oregon. But think of our national highway system. We need to essentially be expanding our electron highway system, and that's why some of these major investments are really we need the federal government to step in. And also, there may be folks in Portland who can say, hey, we can do some of these major projects ourselves. We can do it with our tax base, but small communities can't. Small cities, you just can't with the SDCs. If you're talking about infrastructure and development, you just don't have the resources. That outside federal support is really key. The other thing, and it struck me when I was in law school, I externed for the United States Army Corps of Engineers, and was really struck that the Army is really promoting energy resources because of supply line issues. And so there's all sorts of organizations and entities that are looking at renewable energy and energy sources because through the need to make that happen. So the renewable energy grid I mentioned, also energy storage. There's some really innovative things happening actually in the Portland metro area with companies developing energy storage. That's going to be key. But some of the other things we could do is just looking at part of the reauthorization, the Stafford Act, which funds FEMA. in the reauthorization that we should include things, and these are looking now at impacts, but things like heat domes. We've lost people in the Central Valley, tragic deaths of farm workers from the heat domes, and that the federal government doesn't currently recognize that under FEMA to provide aid. So the Farm Bill as well, and soil programs and soil stabilization, those are ways that we can also help form carbon sinks here in the state.
Okay. So let's move on then. So Jamie, nearly every one of your potential constituents relies or will rely on Social Security benefits in retirement. The Congressional Budget Office projects Social Security costs will outstrip the fund by 2033. Among the options to keep Social Security alive are raising payroll taxes or cutting benefits. What's one specific action you would propose to help stabilize the Social Security system? Just one.
Just one. Well, in first of all, Social Security, a deal made is a deal kept. So people have invested in this, and being able to retire with dignity is critically important and something that is really near dear to me. One thing is corporations paying their fair share. We know that the rate on corporations is much lower than it is on folks who help stock our grocery stores. And I'm, the only one not in this race, not just in the primary, but in the general as well, who's never taken corporate PAC money. And that means you have to work harder when you're doing fundraising so you can get your message out. But what's really key about that is accountability. I'm really proud to be accountable to everyday Oregonians, to working families and seniors and students, and people who are working hard to put a roof over their head and food on their table. I'm a small business owner myself. It's nothing against corporations, but fair share is really key. There's also, frankly, I think we need to be looking at the overall economy. We need to be leaning into building more stuff here in this country and raising up our manufacturing. So right now, if we raise our exports or raise our manufacturing, there will be additional resources that will flow into to our coffers that will allow us, that will comparatively, the outlays then will be less than the expenses that we're investing in. So it's a big piece of it, again, is paying fair share. And I know there's a lot of noise that goes back and forth on that. But if we look back to where fair-minded Republicans were in their policies just a decade or two back, this is something that was pretty standard. So that's one of those kind of core values in rural communities. You pay your fair share, you help carry the load, and that's something that corporations have not just been doing. And lastly, on not taking corporate PAC money, taking money does influence your vote. And I'm very proud that I will be accountable to Oregonians with my vote.
Right. So Janelle, fixing Social Security.
I would say, as a member of the sandwich generation, I look forward and I look backward, and I think my mother and in-laws are of that age where Social Security is meaningful to them. And when I look backwards and I look at my children and what they have to look forward to, I remember my daughter getting her first check asking me, "What's this thing on here? They're taking money out." And I was like, "Oh, you'll never see that again." And that's unfortunate to have to explain that to your kids. What I think is really, again, from the perspective of a mother, I personally challenge how much we're spending on war. And I quite frankly, I have a problem with it. How much we're spending on war machines, war around the world, that is of particular concern to me. It's not something that we talk about quite a bit, but when I think about if you frame it in light of how much we're investing in education, how much we're investing in innovation, how much we're investing in the next generation, in housing, we know that we're 10 to 50 years behind in rebuilding housing in this country, investing in our transportation infrastructure, investing in broadband. When we think about all of the things that make lives better for everyday Americans and how much we're spending on not investing in peace, that is a challenge for me. So I would tackle our defense budget, which I know would be an uphill battle. And I believe in a strong defense. I just question if we need to be investing in war so much.
Okay, thank you. So the next question goes to you, Janelle. What proposal would you advance for the federal government to help improve schooling in Oregon, where our test scores are among the worst in the country?
First of all, as the parent of a special needs kid, I have had my long battles with trying to advocate for them and getting the special education services that they need. And we know that our most vulnerable kids are not getting what they need. So never mind test scores, like even just the basics, they're not getting. We saw that they had reduced school days, parents sued. We've tried to increase the number of students that are allowed to get special reimbursement for funds at the school district. Everything centers around making sure that you take care of your most vulnerable students first. The second part, I would say, so funding IDA is number one. The second is, I think Oregon has had a challenge with making sure that we pay our teachers fairly, that we recruit and train teachers who can stay here and have a comfortable living. That teacher recruitment pipeline is something that I think that that the federal government, we can invest in more heavily to make sure that students around the state don't experience a shortfall in their education because there aren't enough well-qualified, trained teachers who are excited to show up every day and love on our kids and treat them and give them the very best. So in essence, I would say a strong teacher recruitment and training program with supports for ensuring they don't have a lot of federal student loans is a proposal that I would have.
Okay. Jamie?
So this is near and dear to my heart because I'm the daughter of a teacher. And my mom would get up early to drive a school bus. She'd teach all day. She drove a school bus home. When I was a small kid, actually, she was a farm worker in the summer. It's how she put food on our table. And I saw her struggle. And in having conversations with teachers across and educators in general across our state, and I'm really proud to have their support in this race, but from across the state, their job has just become untenable, not getting the support they need. Also safety issues, there's stress in our students. You know, the system was already broken before COVID, and COVID just exacerbated so many of the challenges faced. I'm proud I was elected to and served on an education service district board in Central Oregon, where we had to address a lot of these issues, especially during COVID. And then also we're seeing students are really struggling under the weight of student debt, and job training is really key because younger folks, including our kids, my kids, not wanting to go into debt are not then investing themselves. So what we need, and I actually wrote an op-ed piece on this that was published in the Bend Bulletin a couple months ago, but we need everything from early childhood education and those investments. We know it's pennies on the dollar for those investments for the benefits we have later. K through 12, so support for education for teachers, making sure our kids are well fed. So reauthorization of the Farm Bill can also lean into that, and food security for our families. I've worked on affordable housing for teachers before and making those investments. Post-secondary is everything from apprenticeships to job training. But one of the things I proposed is a civilian GI Bill. And what this would do, it will help to prepare a specialized workforce, so teachers and nurses and other professions where you could go to school debt-free, and then you work in areas where you're needed, rural areas and inner cities. This is an effort that would help us to both get people into that professional pipeline and also get people to lean into training to become professionals.
Okay, thank you. So, Jamie, what threat, if any, do you see to the tradition of democratic practices in the United States right now?
And I apologize, Les, there was some crackling when you asked that question. Can you please ask it?
I'm sorry, let me repeat the question. The question is, what threat, if any, do you see to the tradition of democratic practices in the United States?
Well, our democracy is under attack from within. We saw that on January 6th. Protecting voting rights is really key, but also the divisiveness that is experienced, that people are engaging in right now is really hurting our democracy. One of the things I love about living in a rural and a purple area was just that people have very different perspectives, and we don't have the luxury of bickering. We need to work together to get things done. I think having more examples of that, we see, heck, Eastern Oregon, I think of the High Desert Partnership, but it's at the local level, and that work being done helps to protect our democracy, but also those fundamental rights, voting rights, that needs to be passed. We need to make sure we're protecting election workers so they can do the job of running elections. I think when I think of politics, I think of my aunt and uncle. My uncle's one of the most conservative people I know. My aunt's one of the most progressive and liberal people I know. Sometimes they can't even talk to each other, and they have to talk to each other through me. But helping people to bridge those political divides is, I think, key to helping our democracy be strong. And codifying other rights, again, abortion, IVF, voting, the right to organize. And we also know there's certain rights now with the Hyde Amendment in place that people don't have. But I mentioned before, my experience in Bosnia and Kosovo, and when you see the alternative, it's very sobering. And people talk about the greatness. We're an imperfect country, but I think that the greatness of our nation is that we're founded not on a common bloodline, but on common beliefs in democracy, in freedom, in justice. That's worth protecting. And I think of someone like Liz Cheney, who I have very different political ideas from, but I would love to argue till I'm blue in the face with her on policy ideas. But I know that she and I would stand shoulder to shoulder on protecting our democracy. I'm proud of that. I think we need more of that in our country.
Janelle?
Well, remember in the beginning, I said that my son had this tattoo and it said me versus me. I think a lot of times Democrats look outside and see threats to democracy as the only threat. So yes, I agree with my opponent, and January 6th was a threat to democracy. But what is also a threat to democracy is young people and apathy. And I remember my kids are 22 and 20 now, and we had to develop a college age voting plan for them. I send my daughter and my son their ballots. I had a conversation with my daughter when she was just starting to vote in Georgia. And I said, well, do you want to be a Georgia voter? Do you want to be an Oregon voter? And she said, Mom, I want to be an Oregon voter because it's easy for me to vote. Here in Georgia, we have to stand in lines. It's hot. They can't give you any water. They can't give you any food. People can't drive you. And at least that's her understanding of it. And so when I asked her about, are her friends voting? And she said, no, Mom, it's just too hard. And I believe that the apathy of young voters is what is going to harm our nation far more than what Trump and his MAGA friends can do. It is within us. It is within the Democratic Party to make sure that our young people are engaged, that we're hearing their issues, that we understand what's at stake for them, and we create a habit of inclusion. We create a habit of them turning in their ballot and making sure their voices are heard each and every election. As I mentioned before, high school kids could turn a school board election in a minute. They absolutely have that power. And so I think that is the greatest threat to democracy. And that is one that I think we actually need to focus on for CD5.
Okay, thank you. So Janelle, let's assume you go to Congress. Of all the issues and topics you could address in Congress, what would be your number one priority as you seek committee assignments and develop expertise? Tell us where you would focus. What would be the most important thing when you got the key to that office in Washington, D.C.?
What I learned with the CHIPS Act and working through all of the ins and outs of that was that Oregon needs infrastructure. We needed infrastructure, so that means roads, that means water, that means sewer, that means broadband, electricity. And we need those in order to build housing and industry. And part of our environmental stewardship says that we use the land that we currently have within our urban growth boundaries before we go and add extra, if that's feasible. One of the things that cities and counties told us was that we have this land, we just can't get to it. And then they said, oh, Representative Bynum, we're going to add all of these jobs. Where are the people going to live? And how are we going to educate them? We absolutely need the money for infrastructure. I will also add that when I was in Redmond, the city councilors told me that Redmond wasn't a place to have a baby or a mental breakdown. And so again, when you think about the infrastructure that we need, it also includes hospitals. It also includes medical infrastructure, so mental health therapists, OBGYNs, all of those things that make life worth living each and every day, whether you're in an urban community or a rural community. Everyone needs infrastructure, and that is my number one goal in Congress.
Okay, thank you. Same question, Jamie. What's number one?
Yeah, and actually, I realized there was a point I missed on the last question when you were talking about threats to democracy. I also want to say money in politics, because that's actually a huge issue, making sure that we're building public trust, but also you can't buy elections. So I think that's a key point. The number one issue for me are going to be working family issues. Yes, there's going to be some big picture things we have to address about codifying our fundamental rights, protecting our democracy, and those will be up and down votes depending on whether or not we get a majority in Congress next year and have a president who will sign the bills. But the day-to-day issues that I'll be working on are those affordability issues for everyday Oregonians, for working people, affordable housing, healthcare, childcare, senior care as well. Those are the things that keep people up at night. Those are the things that are the barriers to people getting ahead. I mean, the fact of the matter is right now, cost of living is high. What's the income that people are experiencing is not helping people cover bills. So earlier we were talking about teachers and educators. They want to be able to take care of our kids and do the job they love, but ultimately they're trying to also put a roof over their head and food on their table, care for their families. So what we want to do I think the most important thing we can do to make sure that Oregonians can live in communities where they thrive, healthy and safe communities, is to make sure that everyday Oregonians get the support that they need. So those affordability issues. And it does tie into some infrastructure issues. I mentioned that in my comments before, so that we can build affordable housing. The work I've done on the ground as a city planner, as a city manager, as an elected council member, is understanding how you impact the quality of life on the ground. And having that experience and understanding is really key. So there's individual tools and techniques like the Community Development Block Grant Fund, CDBG, to increase that funding and target it to affordability. But making sure that front and center is, looking at the impacts on people's lives and making sure we're making people's lives better. That's the job.
Right. Okay, and this will be the last question for the evening. So, Jamie, if you were in Congress, we've had a number of comments tonight about the urban rural issues and working together to bridge that. But if you were in Congress, how would you act on a policy issue that affects urban constituents and rural constituents very differently? And federal water policy probably would be a very good example of that. How are you going to navigate very stark policy differences among your constituents?
Yeah, this is a great question. And as I mentioned, I've been elected and served in both urban and rural areas, whether it's, and water policy, of course, water law is state law, unless it crosses over jurisdiction and boundaries. But issues like housing, there are resources that can be allocated to states to allocate. I mentioned the CDBG funds that are allocated to folks at the local level. What's important, I think, is to understand that there needs to be flexibility. And if you only have one perspective, then you're not necessarily going to include that flexibility in the funding programs and the funding streams. Ultimately, you want the impact to land on the ground so it can improve people's lives. But I remember a couple of years ago when the legislature was having a conversation about housing and the housing shortage, there was a bill that was passed that worked really well for the Portland area, and that's great. But I had a buddy of mine who was on the city council in Hermiston who was so frustrated because he said that bill actually made their job harder to be able to develop housing in Hermiston. So making sure that you have that understanding, that you're showing up and listening, but also the experience, I think, is really key. Having experience, having done this work on the ground, it is challenging, it is hard. Having the relationships throughout the district, and I have them. That's why I did so well last cycle. That's why I had one of the closest races in the country. That's the base we're going to build on to win in November. And so making sure that you're showing up, you're listening, you're understanding issues, and then making sure that that flexibility is baked into legislation. I think that's the key. Whenever you have one party that is more heavily in power and they have only one perspective, and often we're hearing it's an urban versus a rural perspective, you don't have that understanding and don't bake into the legislation the flexibility to make sure people can be successful in urban and rural areas.
Janelle?
Well, one thing I want to comment on is this idea of the urban-rural divide. I've always been a leader that seeks to include everyone rather than feeding into a divisive argument. And so what I've learned is that people have very similar issues. It's the contours of them that are just slightly different. So even when we talk about broadband, and we say, oh, rural Oregon doesn't have enough broadband at the right speeds to deliver things like telehealth and education. You know what? Lentz, 82nd and Foster in Portland, doesn't have broadband at the same rate that it should have either. So it's this idea, it's almost like people are kind of fomenting this division. I reject that. And what I have always tried to do over these last 8 years in the legislature is balance the rural and urban needs, or actually just the different needs of different communities. They can be side by side and have very, very different outcomes. There's a difference between Happy Valley and Gresham, two totally different cities side by side. What I think is really important is that when you're developing policy, I agree with Jamie. It needs to be flexible, and almost like the immigration argument, it needs to be fair and it needs to be fast. We can't create bureaucratic barriers to communities getting what they need. And then the last point I want to make on this is when you're trying to develop policy, I think it's unwise to assume that you know everything. So one of the questions that we're always asked as legislators is, when you don't know something, who do you ask? And so in these issues, I promise to, and I commit to asking the people who know best on those issues. So whether it's farmers, whether it's teachers, whether it's city councilmen, I promise to always ask and be there.
Great, thank you. Well, again, that was our final question for the evening. We could go on for another couple of hours. There's a lot of interesting topics that I'm sure you would love to address, but now we're going to go to concluding remarks from the candidates, and we'll start with you, Jamie, for 2 minutes.
Well, thank you so much for providing this opportunity to talk to you and talk to voters. I'll say that people are tired of politics. They're tired of the divisiveness. People just want solutions. And so that focus on kitchen table issues and cost of living, and those both the big picture, our fundamental rights, our democracy, but also those day-to-day issues that Oregonians are facing, that's the focus. How do we get there and make that happen? Because the current representative has failed. She's failed to lead in times when Oregonians have needed her most. And so, I'm the only one who's beaten her in Clackamas and Deschutes County. I had one of the closest races in the country last cycle. I'm well positioned with the base and the support I have throughout the district, Oregonians in the district. And I'm really proud. It's one thing. I just want to say I'm proud of the everyday Oregonians who are supporting me. And it's also that accountability. I've mentioned a couple times, but not taking corporate PAC money matters. That means that I am accountable to Oregonians. That's first and foremost, and that's the bottom line. So it's not just in public, but those behind the scenes, behind closed doors conversations. It's about Oregonians and the needs of Oregonians. And it's also an issue that people have flagged. It's not about being accountable to party bosses. It's about being accountable to Oregonians. We have a proud tradition here in Oregon of being independent minded and having experience in both urban and rural areas. That's what I'm about. That's why I've got the support I do. And that's what I would proudly represent on behalf of Oregonians in Congress. And that's why also folks have said I'm the best fit for the district and the one position to win in November. It's folks like myself, our families are also under attack. And I don't, I will just say that when I came out, it's about LGBTQ youth who were at risk, and that's a big challenge we're facing now. But I'd be honored to have the vote of Oregonians and proud to have folks support.
Okay, thank you. Janelle, 2 minutes.
City Club and Les, thank you so much for having us here tonight. We've all gathered here for the very same reason. Elections have consequences, and we really can't afford another Lori Chavez DeRemer term. With her representing us in Congress, our voices aren't at the table. The needs of our community aren't being prioritized. And instead, we have a representative who's more interested in pleasing the most extreme members of her party and special interests than actually legislating. The numbers don't lie. I'm the only one who has beaten Lori Chavez DeRemer twice and will beat her again. And that's because with the toughest challenges of our time, whether it be climate, housing, safety, reproductive health, I will always bring people together, have tough discussions, and find common ground. And because of that ethos, I actually have a track record of tangible success. Because parents recognize when their kids are learning, community members know when their community is safer, commuters recognize when their drive to work gets a little bit better, and working people are excited about the investment in the semiconductor industry and the creation of good jobs close to home. I'll close with this. The perspective that I bring is valuable. As a small businesswoman who knows what it's like to sign a first check and support a thriving local economy, as an engineer who likes to take apart complex issues and put together solutions, as a mom of 4 children who wants our daughters and our sons to have the same rights. At the end of the day, to me, it is about our children. Are they safe? Are they nourished? Do they have access to a high-quality education? Will they have better opportunities than their parents? Our children are watching as their fates are being decided in the halls of power. Thank you so much for having me tonight. I invite you to learn more and join Team Bynum at janellebynum.com. And just like the mailman who shows up every day as your next Congresswoman from Oregon, I'll deliver for you.
All right. Well, thank you to both of our candidates for your attentive and thoughtful answers this evening. I think thanks goes to the City Club of Portland for organizing this event to provide voters important information. You can find a recording of this event on the City Club website later on. But most importantly, the thanks go to those of you who are watching and absorbing the information this evening. This election is important. It's important for Oregon. It's important for the country. No matter your choices, vote. Your one vote does matter. Don't ever forget that. With that, we bid you a good night to all.